8 women who changed the world. It's an annual event we host for Women's History Month, and it's an evening to celebrate the accomplishments of women in their disciplines and how they really changed the world we live in. So tonight, I'm very honored to introduce a number of faculty and staff at Misericordia University who are going to be presenting on women in their field. There is no Q&A tonight. It's just going to be presentations, and we're just going to move from one presentation to the next. Though I encourage you, if you have any questions about any of the material you hear tonight, to either take the suggestion of reading books that might be provided by some of our panelists, or to email them directly. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. And I should say my name is Dr. Amanda Caleb, and I am a professor of English and Medical and Health Humanities at Misericordia University. Probably should have led with that, but there you go. So our first presenter tonight is Dr. Jennifer Black, who's an associate professor of history and government. Dr. Black, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'm very pleased to be chatting with you tonight about Ida B. Wells Barnett. So I'm just going to share my screen. So Ida B. Wells Barnett was born into slavery in Mississippi in 1862. So that's 1 year before emancipation during the Civil War. She was one of 8 children. Her father was very active in Reconstruction politics after the war ended. But at age 16, both of her parents died, along with one of her younger brothers, during a yellow fever outbreak in Mississippi. Ida B. Wells had to drop out of school and take a job to support her younger siblings. She actually lied about her age, saying that she was 18 instead of just 16. By 1882, she had moved to Memphis, Tennessee, with her younger siblings to move in with an aunt of hers. She continued to work as a school teacher, but she took an interest in journalism. And she eventually would own 2 newspapers in Memphis. And this is the period of her life when she began to become really active in campaigning for the end of lynching and the end of violence against African Americans across the United States. And that, of course, is what she's most known for today. In the 1890s, she witnessed firsthand the horrors of extralegal justice in the South when her friend, Thomas Moss, and some of his associates were lynched very mercilessly in Memphis because he had opened a grocery store across the street from a very popular white-owned grocery store in town. After Thomas was killed, Ida B. Wells set out to investigate his death and to uncover similar episodes of violence. She actually crisscrossed the South for several years, conducting eyewitness interviews and digging up records that would reveal dozens of similar cases to that of her friend. She pioneered many reporting techniques that would form the foundations for modern journalism today. And historians consider her to be one of the most famous African Americans of the 19th century, and certainly the most famous Black woman of the 19th century. By the time she was in her 30s, now we're looking at the 1890s, Wells embarked on an anti-lynching campaign that would consume much of the activist work that would occupy the rest of her life. She published her findings from her surveys in editorials in the newspaper that she co-owned and edited, and it was called the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. She also compiled her reports later in the publication I'm showing you here, Southern Horrors. Her goal in this study was really to question the stereotype that was often used to justify lynchings. That stereotype said that Black men were inherently rapists. Instead, she found that 2/3 of the mob murders that occurred with lynchings were really attributed not to rape. Rape had never even been an accusation. She often found evidence in cases where there were accusations of rape that there had actually been a consensual relationship between the Black man and a white woman in town. And she's known for saying, quote, "Nobody in this section of the country believes the threadbare old lie that Black men rape white women." I'll continue, quote, "It is with no pleasure that I have dipped my hands in the corruption here exposed," Wells wrote. She argued that, quote, somebody must show that the Afro-American race is more sinned against than sinning, and it seems to have fallen upon me to do so. Ida B. Wells chronicled account after account of lynchings across the South, arguing that this mode of vigilante justice was outside the law, and it remained an exercise intended to preserve white supremacy and economic power. Quote, the more I studied the situation, she noted, quote, the more I was convinced that the Southerner had never gotten over his resentment that the Black man was no longer his plaything or servant, no longer his source of income. Every inch of social and economic mobility gained by African Americans had been met with bitterness and hatred by whites in this time period. And Ida B. Wells said, quote, here came lynch law to stifle Black manhood, which defended itself. And the burning alive of Black men who were weak enough to accept favors from white women, all to strike terror into the hearts of other Black men who might be thinking of consorting with white women, or who might be thinking of challenging the power of whites. Following the publication of her exposés, a white mob attacked and burned down Ida B. Wells' newspaper offices in Memphis, forcing her to flee to Chicago, where she would remain the rest of her life. But she did not give up on her cause. She continued to publish scathing critiques of racial discrimination and white prejudice against Blacks. Her articles were often reprinted in newspapers abroad, as well as in various weekly newspapers produced in African American communities across the United States. She campaigned tirelessly for federal legislation that would outlaw lynching, traveling abroad, even to Europe, to draw support for her cause. And though her campaign was not successful, in fact, federal anti-hate legislation or hate crime legislation would not be passed until much later in the 20th century, Ida B. Wells remained undeterred in her resolve to improve the lives of African Americans. She became a prominent member of the women's suffrage movement. She was instrumental in founding the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, two organizations that became prominent in the movement for civil rights later in the 20th century. As a former slave who stood less than 5 feet tall, Ida B. Wells Barnett took on structural racism more than half a century before the civil rights movement that we all know. She remained steadfast in her dedication to her cause, arguing that if she could in any way contribute to improving the situation for African Americans, that she will have done a service to her people. She died in 1931. In recognition for her lifelong activist work, Ida B. Wells Barnett received a posthumous obituary in the New York Times in 2018 and a Pulitzer Prize in 2020 for her work to expose and end violence against African Americans. She is definitely someone who changed the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Black, for that great presentation, a very timely presentation, I might add as well. Our next presenter is Dr. Linda Ocker, Assistant Professor of Biology. Linda, the floor is yours.
Okay, hey everyone. I'm presenting on Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who is a marine ecologist, much like myself. And so I have a lot of wonderful things to say about her, so let me get started. Dr. Lubchenco is a marine ecologist, as I mentioned, and most of her early research, her graduate research, dealt with studying patterns of zonation in the rocky intertidal. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay. But essentially, if you ever take any ecology course or marine biology course, you're going to study something that Dr. Lubchenco published on or did research on, because she's one of the earliest researchers to look at zonation and community structure in marine environments. She is also currently highly involved in government and policy. And I'll tell you why in a few minutes. So her biography, just to give you a little bit of her background. Her education, she has a bachelor's of arts in biology from Colorado College, a master's in zoology from University of Washington, and a PhD in ecology from Harvard. And she spent her first years teaching at Harvard as a professor. And then she spent most of her career at Oregon State University. You'll notice the timeline there, 1977 to 2009. And in 2009, she was actually selected to be the NOAA administrator from 2009 to 2013. She was part of Obama's science dream team. All right. So this is really cool. A lot of her work has been so important. She's been such a vocal proponent for ocean health, marine health, but not only that, for, environmental science, that she was recognized at that national level. Now, in 2013, she stepped down to return to academic life, but she also has many awards and accolades. Some we'll touch on here, but if you want to learn more about her, she's got a great website, janelubchenko.com. You can check it out. But she had a distinguished visitor professorship at Stanford University and is currently at Oregon State up until very recently, which I learned long after I'd chosen to talk about her tonight. In 2021, actually a few weeks ago, she was picked to be the Deputy Director for Climate and the Environment in the Biden administration. So pretty cool. So how has she actually changed the world? Well, in two different ways, right? In her research, but also in her policy work, right? So as a marine ecologist, I recognized her first because of her research. And if you look at her citations, she's been cited a lot. She has one paper that she co-wrote about human domination of Earth's ecosystems that has over 11,000 citations. I mean, I think a lot of us are maybe a little jealous of that citation rate. It's pretty awesome. And she has other work that she's done as well. These are some of her more highly cited papers. But just to kind of bring your attention to the one at the bottom of the screen, that was cited by over 1,200 papers. This is from some of her graduate work that she did while at Harvard. So while there, she studied the rocky intertidal. And if you've ever gone anywhere in like New England, they have these really rocky beaches. They don't look like the Atlantic City or Ocean City beaches, right? But if you go during low tide, you'll notice there's lots of algae. The rocks are really slippery because of the algae, but there's mussels and barnacles, all kinds of cool organisms. And her research led her to kind of examine both the abiotic, we call it, which is the physical features, and the biotic, the living things that determine the structure of a community. So they looked at, she and her partner, Bruce Menke, looked at the wave action, right? That's the abiotic factor, but also predation by herbivorous snails, and trying to understand how this caused algae to have actual bands down the rocky intertidal. This work is really important because as we think about how some abiotic factors change due to climate change, and how invasive species come in changing biotic structure, that's going to change entire community of these pretty ecologically important marine communities. So her work has been so important in marine ecology. Like I said, you're not going to get through an ecology course probably without learning about something that she studied. That when she was brought to her confirmation hearing in 2009, she was introduced as the bionic woman of good science, which I love that quote, right? So this leads into her policy and government career. She was the first woman to head NOAA, right? The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But during her time, she faced some challenges, right? During this time was the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And NOAA, under her directive, did lots and lots of stuff, right, to respond to the oil spill, also to study the oil spill. In a paper published in 2012, she highlighted all of the different ways that NOAA had responded. And if you notice, they looked at everything from studying the well to the, itself. And you can see here that, there's various NOAA ships that kind of were sent out to do these studies, to looking at water quality, water chemistry, as well as looking at the impacts on the marine ecology as well. So NOAA was highly involved in trying to understand what the impacts were of this oil spill. So her legacy is kind of nicely highlighted by Michael Conathan, the director of ocean policy at the time for the Center for American Progress, where he said Jane Lubchenco's tenure as NOAA administrator has proven the value of having an ocean scientist at the helm of our nation's preeminent ocean science agency, right? So having someone who's an expert on oceans leading the ocean thing, right, in the government. So she has achieved tremendous success in the face of stark adversity, which includes oil spills, which include a very tough tornado season in 2011, also included Hurricane Sandy, right? And so NOAA had to respond to all of those issues. So because of a lot of her work she's done in both government and policy, she's been seen as one of the most influential marine ecologists. She's been the first recipient of the Mary Sears Medal by the Oceanography Society, which is awarded in recognition of extraordinary accomplishments and novel insights in the areas of biological oceanography, marine biology, and marine ecology. So that was last year in 2020, where she was awarded that. And then this is an article that came out from Reuters just not that long ago, March 19th, 2021, that shows that she was picked to lead climate in White House Science Office. So not only has she changed the world of marine ecology, she's still in the process of changing the world as we're thinking about how our country responds to climate change and how it's changing our environment itself.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Acker, and telling us more about my favorite phrase, I think, ever now, Bionic Woman of Good Science, is an incredible title. So thank you for sharing her story with us.
Absolutely.
Our next presenter is Dr. Patrick Danner, who's an assistant professor of English. Dr. Danner, it's all yours.
All right. Okay, so I am here to talk about Dr. Janet Emig, who I personally see as one of the most influential figures in rhetoric and writing studies up to this point. She represents this sort of class of writing scholars and writing studies scholars in the 1960s and 70s. That includes a lot of names that, if you're familiar, work in writing or education, you might know names like Peter Elbow, Donald Murray, who really created this kind of modern version of what we now call writing studies and really sort of cemented the way we teach writing today. But to go further, I think Janet Emig kind of stands alone and deserves greater recognition for, this one huge thing that we all really take for granted, and that's this idea that writing is a process. So it helps to know a bit about where the field of writing studies and teaching writing was before Emig's work. Prior to the 1960s, most writing instruction sort of fit this model that we called current traditional rhetoric, or CTR for short. And this is kind of like a neoclassical vision of, the 19th century classroom in America. And by the 20th century, CTR sort of made itself known mostly through what at the time we called themes. So themes in the writing classroom, if you're unfamiliar with them, and to sort of, be brief here, are at the core of this way of teaching writing that as students just mimic essay structures and just grade them on style and grammar. So prior to Emig, that's a lot of what was happening in the writing classroom. So current traditional rhetoric sort of would give students essay topics and a structure to follow. If you look this up, one example that keeps getting thrown around is, in the 1930s, pretty much every student in the US was writing essays about how bicycles work, right? And there was a set structure of how you had to write this essay. You turned it in and you were graded for primarily your grammar. And some of this, I think, still lingers today, to be fair, right? Everybody all of us and all the students out there watching know exactly what I'm talking about when I say, quote, the 5-paragraph essay. Right? So we still have some of that today, but Emig, I think, is a major figure in breaking us away from that. So current traditional rhetoric had this long run, probably from about 1880 to the 1960s, before it was really actively critiqued by people who were studying and teaching writing. As different kinds of students were coming into the classroom, primarily women and people of color, scholars of writing and education sort of looked at this field and decided we had to reevaluate what we were doing. So some of the key criticisms of current traditional rhetoric are up there on the screen. One, it ignored the idea that all writing is for an audience. Two, current traditional rhetoric was ignoring the identity of the writer themselves. Three, current traditional rhetoric was really just having students mimic what was handed to them. And four, current traditional rhetoric had teachers teaching the sort of conformity to a product rather than understanding that writing is this process of exploration. So in the mid-1960s, early to mid-1960s, these criticisms that were kind of starting to bubble up were really bolstered by these two events. And this is where I'm really going to nerd out about the history of studying writing. So the first was this call in this journal, Research and Written Communication. And that was really the first time that the writing process was named as an object to be studied. And second, in this, if you study writing, is, you know, this very famous thing, people reference it all the time, was the Dartmouth Conference of 1966. That wasn't its official name, but that's what we all call it now. And that conference really began as getting all of these English teachers in a room to reevaluate English curricula in the United States. But instead, they all decided that one thing they could all agree on was that current traditional rhetoric and the way writing had been taught was no longer working. So most people look at Janet Emig's work as coming out of that conference, but you can do just even cursory research to realize that she was making these same criticisms of the way writing was taught years before that conference. So just to give one example, this article she wrote in 1964 called The Uses of the Unconscious in Composing is really one of the first times we see the writing process pointed to by somebody in the field. She's doing things like hypothesizing that the environment students write in will affect their writing, which had never been said before. And she's really looking at how writing happens for individual students. The publication that she's probably best known for, which really expanded on this study of the writing processes, of this book called The Composing Process of 12th Graders, which was published by the National Council of Teachers of English in 1970. And I really can't stress how many firsts in the field come out of this book. So this is the first book that studies student writing processes themselves. And I want to emphasize plural processes. Every student has their own way of writing. It's the first ethnographic study of writing practices in the US, which means it's the first time somebody has sat and watched students write and talked to them about writing and how they feel about writing and made a book out of it. It's the first claim that we have individual writing practices tied to our identities and the circumstances we're writing in. And interestingly, it's this first use of what's called think aloud protocols in the field, which is sort of this strange thing that researchers did for a while of having students sort of talk about their writing as they're doing it. And it was so kind of novel at the time that there were articles written about this research she was doing and calling it, you know, very strange. I found one quote here: Emig has her students talk out loud while writing, a novel practice that needs scrutiny, right? So she's really kind of breaking barriers here. And my favorite detail from the book is, and you know, for me personally, this kind of changed the way I teach in a big way. It's really the first book that comes out questioning whether or not writing instructors would be better off just reflecting on their own writing practices as they teach, right? The sort of think about writing as this multi-step process rather than handing students something and say, make your writing look like this. And for the faculty here, all of that was the result of her dissertation, which I think is incredibly fascinating. Super rare that a dissertation would lead to all of that, being published at all. So through the 70s, she continued this work. She embraced more ideas of cognition and learning in her theorizing, which sort of hinted at this big turn that the study of writing and writing practices was going to make in the 1980s. In her 1977 article, Writing as a Mode of Learning, she mapped some popular theories of learning at the time onto writing as a process and a practice. I want to point out in particular number 4 in both columns there, which was really sort of new at the time, was this idea that writing is active, engaged, personal, and notably self-rhythmed. It's writing like this and research like this that really led to a huge downturn in time writing in the classroom after the 1970s, right? Because if writing is self-rhythmed, as she sort of, theorized it was, then it's not something that could be contained by time. So to wrap up and to make it, very much, or to wrap up and really look closely at what she did for the field of rhetoric and writing studies, her influence is really felt decades later. She created what other scholars in the field of now just call our givens. I have this big book of writing studies in front of me, and the first chapter is called Our Givens, and Emig is all over that chapter, excuse me. So the writing process that she developed in 1970 was formalized a couple years later, and that's the writing process, the pre-writing, writing, and revision that we all know today. The idea, again, of these plural processes inform what we now know as writing across the curriculum or writing in the disciplines. The methods she used in her research created a whole field of people studying the cognition of writing in the 1980s. The fact that she was really beating the drum and having us all talk about audience and writing for an audience, that really shows up in a big way in the 1990s. That's why I personally teach rhetoric in my writing classroom. And her focus on writer identity became the seed of the social justice turn of the 2000s. And, I can even go on from there. Over the past 10 years, the field's really studying the environments we write in. And Emig, as you saw a few slides ago, was doing that in 1970. So just for some final thoughts, Emig is notoriously private, which is why there's not a lot of biography in here and not a lot of thoughts on her own work. She doesn't do a ton of interviews. Honestly, I could not even find a picture of her on the internet from within like the last 30 years. So that's why there's a lack of biography here. But what we do know, she remains a professor emeritus of education at Rutgers University. She still lives in New Jersey, and every year we have the Janet Emig Award from the National Council of Teachers of English for scholarship in English education. And if you do have more questions, you have my email right at the bottom there, pdanner@Misericordia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Danner, for telling us about a woman who probably we've all benefited from her work in how we learned how to write and how we're thinking. So thank you so much. Right, our next presenter is Dr. Tiffany Mullally, who's an assistant professor of education. Dr. Mullally, the floor is yours.
All right. Okay, so the woman that I'm going to speak about today is Lael Wilcox. She's an ultra distance cyclist. And just a little background on that, because might not be a term that everyone is familiar with. So the idea of this ultra distance cycling is a race or a ride, because a lot of people just do it for fun. I don't know why, but they do, where they're going farther than 100 miles or for a period of 6 hours or longer. Most often these races are going to be in that 6-hour range, or they can go all the way to 5,000 kilometers. The idea behind it is these are self-sustained. So that means on your bike, you are packing everything. You do not have outside help. The only thing that is available to you are the things that are going to be available to everyone else. So on your route, you can access bike shops, but you can't have friends meet you. You can't have family give you food, anything like that. It is just you all by yourself. So as it is now, women participation in this ultra distance cycling is only about 3 to 11%, which is a really low number. So why is her role in this important? I'm not going to read all this, so don't freak out. The idea is that this ultra distance is going to be a great equalizer for the gender disparity. We're familiar with the different sports and the inequities that might come about in them and the arguments that are made. So right now, women's soccer is battling for equal pay. And the argument is always, well, it's not the same playing field. If you played against men, even though you've won, this many championships, you still wouldn't beat, I've heard it said, the JV squad or something like that. So it's always like, well, you can't compare the two. No matter how many, championships Serena Williams wins, she'd lose to a guy is always the argument. So here they are running the same race and everything is the same. And the research is showing that there is this linear relationship between this disparity in the genders and the distance that it goes. So the further the distance, the smaller the disparity. And that goes across, all ultra distance in running. So going from small distances to these ultra marathons, women are getting closer. In swimming, a lot of times in swimming, women are actually winning these events. And there's always arguments that are made then when Diana Nyad, she was the first person to go from Cuba to Florida. There's always these arguments that there was cheating involved, and we'll get into that, a little bit later on. But the idea is the further the distance, the less disparity. So that brings us to Lael. So who is she? She is a 34-year-old woman from Anchorage, Alaska, who started riding at 20 years old. So that means she has 14 years of riding under her belt, which really isn't that much in the grand scheme of things. So in 2015, she takes on the Tour Divide, which is a ride that goes from Canada all the way down to New Mexico. And all self-sustained, you have to do it on your own, is 2,750 miles, and she gets the female record, which is impressive in its own right. She ends up doing it in 17 days, 1 hour and 45 minutes or something like that. But what's crazy about it is the fact that this is only the second race that she's ever done. She shows up in just regular everyday clothes, and she ends up getting nasty sick during it with this upper respiratory infection. So the entire state of Montana that she's riding through, she has this infection, plus the time that she's in the hospital during this stay. So during that time, things are going crazy, and she still ends up beating the previous woman's time by 2 days. Totally insane. And she ends up, I think, a day and a half behind the leader of the race. So then we move on to the Trans Am race in 2016, which goes across the United States. 4,300 miles. She ends up being the overall winner, male or female overall winner, which is the first time this has happened. So first female and first American. It takes her 18 days and 10 minutes. And then we have the Baja Divide in 2017. So this covers 1,700 miles. It's actually a route that she helped develop, and it goes all along the California border. She has the fastest known time in 2017, male or female. And then it was broken in 2018 by only 2 hours. So she still stands, I believe, at the second fastest known time. Amazing. So it's interesting in all of these, to win these races, she's going on less than 5 hours of sleep. The food that she picks up is stuff that she finds at the convenient mart with the most calories for, bang for her buck there. And she, in that, sorry, I got ahead of myself. On the Trans Am where she won, she ends up, it's the last day, and there's a guy that is 40 miles ahead of her. That's the lead guy. He ends up waking up in the morning, getting confused, starts pedaling in the wrong direction. She ends up passing him, and he's like, oh, well, let's ride it together. And she's like, heck no, this is a race. So she sprints out the last 130 miles of this ride in, I forget how long it is, but she ends up beating the guy that was right behind her by 2 hours. So that's insane on its own right. So then we come to the 2019 Tour Divide. So this is the one that she got sick at the first time. And all of the media has an eye on her because they say that she's going to win it. Not just the female bracket, all of it. She is going to win it. So there's this, controversy that goes around it because she has these affiliations now with these Radavis company and bike packing, and they want to do this sort of documentary following her. Well, she gets everything set up ahead of time, a year ahead, and then it is like 2 weeks before the race, and the director is like, we just don't feel comfortable with you having this media following you because it's giving you an unfair advantage. Her partner is actually one of the people in the media crew, so they are like, we have to set up all these parameters. Now, this isn't the first time that there's been media at these events. There's been other cyclists, including the director, that has had media behind them before. There are other cyclists in this race that had media groups following them, but they put this restriction on her. So everybody in this media group has to have a tracker on her to make sure that they aren't having contact with Lael. She has to give up her cell phone, which is her contact, and her mapping device, so that she has to give up that. And she has to make sure that she has no contact with anybody in there at this point. So she is like, whatever it takes for me to ride. Well, it turns out as they're passing one of the 50, mountain passes that they have, they end up in a giant snowstorm. So most of the people end up scratching. So they're thinking that next on, she still has a chance, but all the battles all the way because, you could think that it's because she's a female trying to break this male record. So how, I mean, she's a cyclist. How can she change the world, right? I get it. But, still the impact that she can have can trickle down. So the first thing is visibility. We all know how important visibility is, especially for women's sports. You look at 1994, the women's soccer team, they weren't showing any games. By 1999, we have full coverage. And by the most recent World Cup, it's one of the most watched events in the world. That's insane. So she has the visibility out there. She is one of the top names on the big organizations, bike packing, Radavis, which would be the ESPN of the, this world. She started Anchorage Grit, which is a program for young girls age second and third grade, where they are riding into tomorrow is the idea of it. And it's this training program for them that's 6 weeks, and she does great things. So far, she's worked with over 50 young girls to get them on a bike. She's increased women representation. We saw that the percentage increase, is only going to help. So she's impacted people like, who are the names? Amity Rockwell and Alexander Huchin, who have both recently won big events like the Dirty Kanza and the Tour Divide on a single speed. And then she created a scholarship, which is helping more women get out there and ride. So, her visibility and her impact, not just on the sport, but on women in sports in general, is huge. When she did the Tour Divide, they have this little tracker that follows them along. Her tracker was watched, and that's boring. And that was watched more than any other athlete, with more comments on her. And I think the impact of that is just massive. These are the references. Won't read those either. And that is all of Lael.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mullally. And I think particularly, again, a very timely topic in light of what we've seen for those who've been following with the NCAA basketball tournament and the treatment of the unequal treatment of the women's teams at this time. So very timely conversation about women in sports, I think, in particular. Right. Our next presenter is Dr. Joseph Curran, who is professor and chair of religious studies. Dr. Curran, the Zoom is yours.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Caleb. And I just want to express my gratitude. First of all, I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to tell you about someone who is a hero to me and was among some of the less important things that she's done in the field. Was my first graduate advisor in graduate school, Dr. Lisa Cahill, who's the J. Donald Monin S.J. Professor of Theology at Boston College, the flagship of Catholic theology in the United States, if anyone's wondering about that. Lisa got her PhD from the University of Chicago and worked there with James Gustafson, who is a well-known moral theologian coming out of the Reformed tradition. And really, Lisa's always had a reputation within Catholic theology for being someone who, builds bridges and holds difficult ideas in tension in a way that allows for dialogue to move forward. She is firmly within the tradition, but she is not afraid to be critical of the tradition in a way that is both necessary and helpful. So she has a reputation for being kind of a bridge builder, for being someone who offers a critique, but a critique from within the community. I'd like to talk about two pretty specific ways that I think she's made a big difference in the profession of moral theology. The first way I'd like to talk about is from a sort of methodological standpoint, and a way that I really think she's transformed Catholic theology to bring together sort of two ways of doing moral theology that are I would say up until the 90s or so were really seen as different avocations within the field. So when you entered into Catholic moral theology up until the 1980s, 1990s, it'd be pretty typical to sort of select a track of either social ethics or what was sometimes simply called moral theology, personal ethics, right? Sexual ethics, biomedical ethics, things like that. And there was a real distinction, I think, between those who were providing theology to guide personal moral choices and those who were providing theological reflection to transform society into a more just society. And Lisa has always been someone who I would say broke down those barriers and tried to bring those two ways of doing moral theology together. And she's got two relatively recent books that I think illustrate how she did that. And we'll start with bioethics, right? This is a quote from the preface of her 2005 Theological Bioethics Participation, Justice, and Change, which won the Catholic Theological Society's Book of the Year Award. Bioethics in the 21st century must in every case be social ethics, not just as theory, but as engagement. This is particularly true in light of globalization. However, even when the focus is what has traditionally been called individual moral decision-making, it is now recognized that the knowledge, options, and judgments of all individuals have always been context-dependent. Thus, individual bioethical decisions cannot be and never have been separated from social ethics. And in the book, Lisa really makes the case that bioethics should be committed not just to guiding personal moral choices with regard to bioethics and what we would call medical ethics, but also to the transformation of society into a more just society where people have the sort of structural support to make better choices and to have access to better medical care and basically a better life. So that sort of bringing together of what we used to think of as these separate areas of personal moral theology and social ethics, and to say you don't do those two things separately, they are always done together. I think that's been an important contribution that she's made to transform the field. And I think fairly often today in Catholic bioethics, you do see that attention to matters of justice and social transformation and so forth. Another important area where I think Lisa's made a contribution there is in regard to just war pacifism and what she's really sort of pioneered in describing as peace building. And this is another dimension of that divide between what we might think of as personal moral choices and social ethics and social justice in Catholic theology, where the just war tradition was seen as the way that theology sort of made compromises, tried to shape policy, sort of got into the nitty-gritty of policymaking and often had to deal with moral compromises in doing so. Whereas pacifists were seen as people who had made a personal commitment to avoid violence, and that was a personal moral choice. And if it had a social dimension, it really had to do with offering a kind of witness, not with transforming society. Now, Lisa's a natural law theologian, which means that she's very much rooted in the examination of experience and rational reflection on lived human life. And in looking at how pacifists and just war theorists approached the problem of violence, what she realized and began to write about was that they were all really about trying to reduce violence, to try to minimize the amount of violence that was taking place in the world. They were taking slightly different approaches, but she wanted to sort of break down that divide and not see these two approaches as opposite ways of dealing with the problem of violence, but really as trying to do a very similar thing. So as she writes in the preface to this book, although this book is a call to the church, it's also a call to Christian ethicists to take a new look at our theological ethical traditions and our current frames of analysis. We should question whether the traditional categories of just war theory and pacifism suffice to capture the theoretical questions and options relevant to a Christian ethic of war and peace, whether they represent accurately the realities of which they purportedly speak. So Lisa wants us to think about both of these activities as really being different forms of peace building, the positive effort to make the world a more peaceful place. And she also writes, I think, in a very creative way about how both pacifism and just war really create very difficult moral dilemmas in the way that they are currently approached. The pacifist is faced with the moral dilemma of renouncing violence, even if violence is the only way to protect the innocent. And the just warrior is presented with the moral dilemma of embracing violence in the pursuit of doing a greater good. And if, her argument is that if we move away from those categories and think instead of this kind of positive peace building, then we avoid those moral dilemmas. So in a Catholic church, in a Catholic moral theological field that often sees this radical division between those who are making personal moral choices that give witness but are not doing much to transform the society on one hand, and those who are working to transform the society, but in doing so are accepting certain sort of moral compromises on the other hand, I think that Lisa's done an awful lot to bring those two together and really think about a much more integrated way of doing moral theology in the Catholic Church. And that's, I think, been her major contribution, especially recently. And I certainly commend those two books. On another level, I think, especially for me personally, I want to tell you about how Lisa has transformed the profession, right? When I was in grad school, I went to the 50th annual meeting of the Catholic Theological Society of America, and it took place in New York City, where the first meeting had taken place. And as part of that meeting, they put up a picture of the first meeting that I want to show to you. That's the first meeting of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Something you'll notice about everybody in the picture is they're all men and they're all priests. So at the time that Lisa started at BC in the 1980s, it was not uncommon for lay people, non-ordained people, to be Catholic theologians, but there was no understanding of a sort of way the profession might develop so that almost all of the Catholic theologians would be lay people. And Lisa recognized that the priests who were theologians, I think, had a real advantage. They were supported by their bishops. They had jobs that allowed them to practice theology freely. They had the economic freedom and the social freedom to engage in theological reflection, whether or not they were teaching at a university. So Lisa was really key in setting up the program at Boston College to be a program that was intentionally targeted to support lay people who were entering into the field of theology. And I found out in later years how much she did behind the scenes that I wasn't even aware of, making sure, for example, that we all had adequate stipends that we could live on, that we all had opportunities for summer work that would allow us to support ourselves while we're doing this, creating the sort of network of support from professionals that priests could take for granted being priests, but lay people did not have. And if you looked at a picture of the annual meeting of the Catholic Theological Society of America today, it would look a lot different than this picture. And I give Lisa an awful lot of credit for that. When I was defending my dissertation, my daughter was 6 months old, and I was defending in a small room. And my wife and I were talking about whether it would be appropriate to have Caitlin there as a baby. She might make a fuss. And I asked Lisa about it. Lisa was on my dissertation committee, and she said, "That little girl belongs in that room." And she said it with a fierceness that I'll never forget. And I think of that a lot because, Lisa would say that woman belongs in that room. That lay person belongs in that room. She's done a lot to open up the room of Catholic theology to a lot of people who did not have access to it before, did not have good access to it. So I am personally grateful to her, and I think the field owes her a great debt for her contribution. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kern, for telling us about a woman who's really changed the field and whose work really fits well with the values we espouse at Misericordia. And we appreciate the personal connection as well. Right, our next presenter is Dr. Cheryl Jane. She's an assistant professor of occupational therapy. So Dr. Jane, you got the Zoom.
Thank you, Dr. Caleb, for the introduction. Tonight, I would like to share with you all a little bit about Dr. Florence Clark, occupational therapist, researcher, and visionary. Occupational therapy is a client-centered healthcare profession whose primary concern is the promotion of health and well-being through engagement in occupation. The goal of occupational therapy is to help individuals participate in everyday activities or occupations that they find meaningful and valuable in whatever environment is important to them. Since the early inception of the profession in 1917, women have played a key role in nearly all aspects of occupational therapy, including the establishment of occupational therapy schools, the formation of a professional association, and the conducting and disseminating of research to support practice and advocacy. According to the 2019 American Occupational Therapy Association Workforce and Salary Survey, nearly 91% of the occupational therapy workforce in the US is made up of women. So the problem is not trying to find a woman who has made a significant impact in the field of OT, but choosing which one of the many women in our 100+ year history has made the biggest impact on the profession. While individual OTs may have differing opinions about who this person might be, my pick is Dr. Florence Clark. Dr. Clark is a widely published and cited author, an occupational therapist, as well as an academician. She is most recognized for her seminal work with older adults living in the community and for her contributions to the development of the scholarly discipline of occupational science. We'll talk about these accomplishments in a minute, as they're the reason that I chose her in particular for this presentation. But like any good superhero movie, we should start with an origin story to get a better sense of how this everyday human being became the focus of a presentation about women who changed the world. Florence Clark was born in 1946 in Brooklyn, New York. She earned a bachelor's degree in English from SUNY Albany, then her master's degree in OT from SUNY Buffalo. Continuing her education, she received a PhD from the University of Southern California, where she eventually took up residence as a professor and associate dean. While she was in the process of earning her education, the profession of occupational therapy was shifting. As we began to gain recognition in the medical community as an important healthcare discipline, some individuals, both outside of OT and within OT, raised concern over the lack of research to support the effectiveness of what it is that we did. Through her research interests, Dr. Clark contributed to not only the research base of occupational therapy, but the recognition of the profession within the community. She also played a pivotal role in the establishment of occupational science, which understands the issues surrounding the need for evidence-informed practice and aims to support occupational therapy and other disciplines with research regarding human occupation. Dr. Clark has been a USC faculty member for more than 40 years and has served as an associate dean at the USC Chan Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy. She has been the past president of the American Occupational Therapy Association from 2010 to 2013. She was also honored with the prestigious Eleanor Clark Lectureship in 1993, the profession's highest academic honor bestowed to leaders in the profession. She has also been awarded more than $10 million in grants to help fund research in the areas of healthy living for older adults, pressure ulcer prevention in individuals with spinal cord injuries, and sensory integration strategies for children with autism spectrum disorder. She is also largely credited with the origins of occupational science. Beginning in 1989, the academic field of occupational science was created to better understand humanity by understanding what people do every day. Occupational science was and is interested in looking at the relationship between everyday activities, such as brushing our teeth and reading a book, to our overall health and well-being as individuals. It is through her work in this new area of research that brought us to what I feel has been her most significant contribution to the profession, the USC Well Elderly Study. The Well Elderly Study, which was conducted between 1994 and 1996, for which Florence Clark was the principal investigator, was a large-scale randomized controlled trial which demonstrated that preventative occupational therapy services increased the health of elderly individuals living within the community. The study was pivotal in showing that not only the value of OT, but supporting the use of preventative services to keep individuals healthy as they age naturally. Not only was this study the largest outcomes research study conducted to date in occupational therapy, but it was also the first occupational therapy research study to appear in the prestigious Journal of the American Medical Association. The study's results were so significant and had such an impact on the way in which aging and occupational therapy services were viewed that she and the other researchers were asked to replicate the study again in 2004 to document the mechanisms that were responsible for the positive results the original study identified. The second incarnation of the Well Elderly Study, which was creatively named the Well Elderly Study 2, further solidified that the original study indicated that public health strategies focusing on the prevention of illness and disability are more effective than treating issues after they had already begun to negatively impact health. The results of this study were published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health and cited worldwide. In addition to interventions that formed the basis of the Well Elderly studies, have been referred to as the lifestyle redesign and are used today to create programs that focus on health promoting behaviors for a variety of individuals, such as those with autism spectrum disorder, those who wish to stop smoking or lose weight, those with multiple sclerosis, and many other issues and areas of concern. The impact of these programs has been so important that USC has dedicated an entire building, seen here on this slide, to the study and implementation of lifestyle redesign in the local community. Florence Clark's impact on the profession of occupational therapy is far-reaching and expansive. She has changed the face of occupational therapy in ways that we never could have imagined. Aside from all of these achievements, though, is the impact that she has had on my education and career. It is because of her Well Elderly study and later her occupational science work that made me want to stretch my legs professionally and explore new roles for OTs. Her work also led me to my academic career. Because of that, I now have the unique opportunity to create a difference in someone else's life in a new way, not only impacting them, but influencing the people they will later work with throughout their careers, creating waves of change. At the heart of it, isn't that what changing the world is all about? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jane, for telling us about someone who's so pivotal in your own field, but really we've all probably benefited from or will benefit from her amazing work. So thank you so much. Our next presenter is Dr. Lael Little, who is director of the Polly Friedman Art Gallery. So Dr. Little, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you. Thank you everyone who has presented so far. Maya Lin changed contemporary representations of death and loss when she was just 21 years old. While an undergraduate student at Yale University in 1980, she did an assignment for her architecture class using the guidelines for the newly announced competition to design a memorial for the soldiers who died during the Vietnam War, which was fought from 1955 to 1975. Veterans of that war received the opposite of a hero's homecoming, as they were ignored, blamed, and plagued by negative stereotypes as drug addicts and killers. By 1979, sentiment was beginning to soften towards those veterans, and a design competition was approved by Congress and open to any American citizen over 18 years of age. The criteria were that the memorial be, number one, reflective and contemplative in character, two, be harmonious with its site and environment, and three, make no political statement about the war itself. 4, contain the names of all who died or remain missing. As an architecture student, Lynn had many inspirations to choose from. The Lincoln Memorial, which opened in 1922, was designed by architect Henry Bacon. Drawing from classical examples of columns and white marble, the monument is modeled after the Greek temple and inspires awe by its size and dedication to symmetry and robust appearance of the giants of our nation's history. And then the contribution of the U.S. Marine Corps as another example is symbolized by the arduous yet successful capture of a small strategically located island off the coast of Japan in 1945. For the Vietnam conflict, however, there's no such emergent hero or defining emblematic event. Instead, Lynn had what she calls a simple impulse to cut into the earth. And this is a copy of her proposal. And she said that the names themselves would become the memorial without all of the usual symbolic or figural trappings of classical monuments that surround them. And she had imagined a polished black granite that would mirror the other monuments on the wall, thus placing the Vietnam War within its historical context. Having finished this project for a class, she submitted it to the design competition and won. The introduction of her design to the public, however, ignited controversy. Critics referred to it as a black gash of shame, sorrow, and degradation, suggested that the polished surface and the V shape were feminizing, orientalizing, and it didn't help that a Washington Post reporter referred to it as an Asian memorial for an Asian war. They suggested that the abstraction would have a cold and distancing effect on visitors. Lynn's personal identity as a young woman of Asian descent from a pompous Ivy League school further discredited the design in the eyes of critics who attributed her conviction to arrogance. That fact that she was of Chinese descent and grew up in Ohio did not mitigate the racist rhetoric that surrounded the criticism of her design. As much as the committee tried to shield her from the most demeaning critiques, Maya Lin did not attend the groundbreaking in 1982. As a compromise, one of the concessions was that a figural representation be included on the site, and Frederick Hart was called in to, as he told Lynn, quote, improve on her design. The statues are meant to be inclusive of the multiracial composition of the veterans, but then that created a prominent lack of representation for women, and a women's memorial by Glenna Goodacre was added to the site in 1993. Fortunately, Maya Lin's vision was eventually realized. On 2 granite walls are incised the names of around 58,000 killed in action or missing in action, beginning at the juncture of the 2 walls in the center, starting in 1955, extending to the right along the sloping walls. The names continue along the left wall up to the top of the center, completing that cycle for 1975. It creates an intimate space with names lined up by date of casualty. The timeline of the war, more than the alphabetical listing of names, would enable those that served together to be able to find each other. The letters, all in 1/2 inch Trajan font, equalizes the memorialized in terms of rank, race, and gender, and requires that the viewer approach the wall in close view. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is the only mall monument that has a traveling replica. And in 2019, we were able to take a group of our students to the replica, which is 2/3 scale, and was being hosted in nearby Plymouth. So Lynn's design not only changed the way memorials are visualized, but changed the way we interact with memorials. Although not all successive national mall memorials have taken on this abstract minimalist format, for example, the World War II Memorial and the MLK Monument, the wall's design's influence can be seen in other prominent memorials around the country. At the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama from 1989, a circular black granite table records the names of the martyrs and chronicles the history of the movement in lines that radiate like hands on a clock. And that's a quote from their site. And water emerges from the table's center and flows evenly across the top. Maya Lin also served on the jury of the World Trade Center Memorial for 9/11. And here there's a photo of former President Barack Obama and former President Bush and his family at the opening in 2011. And the names are inscribed along the edges of the wall if you have not been personally to see it. In 2009, Lynn was awarded the National Medal of Arts, the nation's highest honor for artistic excellence. And in 2016, President Barack Obama awarded Lynn the nation's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Maya Lin continues to create from her homes in New York and Colorado, and the aesthetic of memory forwarded by the memorial continues to heal generations of those affected by violence and conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Little, for telling us about Maya Lin and her really amazing work that's had such an impact on the art world and all of us. Our last presenter for tonight is Dr. Heidi Manning, Dean of College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Physics. So Dr. Manning, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Caleb. I'm here to tell you about Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin, and she is a woman who not only changed the world, but changed our understanding of the universe. So, Cecilia Gaposchkin was born in 1900 in England. She started her education at Cambridge University, but she didn't ever receive a degree from Cambridge because at that time, in 1923, when she finished her studies, Cambridge didn't award degrees to women. She left Cambridge and got a fellowship to attend Harvard University, where she wrote her PhD thesis in 1925. The title of her thesis is Stellar Atmospheres, and this was her most significant contribution to the field. A little bit of background about her contribution. I have to tell you a little bit about astronomy. So if you take the light coming from the sun, pass it through a prism, and see the entire rainbow, you don't get a completely uniform rainbow, but there's little dark lines that when you look very closely, you can see them. We knew about these dark lines way back in 1814. They were discovered by Fraunhofer. In the late 1800s, researcher Pickering, who was working at Harvard, began collecting these spectra from thousands of stars. And Pickering went and hired many women to study these thousands of spectra that he had been collecting. And these women that were hired to basically look at the spectra and look at the different lines that were present are known as the Harvard computers. Annie Jump Cannon was one of those women. She developed this scheme to classify stars based on their spectra. It was an empirical model. She didn't know the theory behind it. She just classified them. So this is the classification that Annie Jump Cannon and her colleagues at Harvard Observatory came up with. And if you look at these different lines, all these little bars that you see that kind of look like barcodes that you'd see on a grocery store item, they have different patterns of light and dark bands. And what these women would do is stare at these photographic plates and classify them based on the patterns of those bands. So if you look at the very top band where it says 04 on the left, you'll see that there's 3 very dark prominent lines. And then if you jump down to say, oh, the F5 line, you'll see that there's 2 dark bands over towards the left. The one that was in the middle is now lighter, as well as the one on the far right. And then as you go down further.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We can't see your screen.
You can't, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Let me see.
We're going to try to fix this really quick. Apologies.
I can do it. I can do it here. We'll get it. Let's see. Thanks for interrupting and telling me.
No worries. It's when you started talking about the bars, we realized we didn't know where we were looking.
Okay. Well, can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
All right. So there's the spectra from the sunlight. And these bars that you can see, this would be like our sun. That's what Pickering was collecting, and Annie Jump Cannon, who's studying these photographic plates. So there's the bars. Looking at the very top, you see the lines that are present. Going further down, you see how that pattern of dark lines and light lines changes. And so what these women were doing was classifying the stars based on this pattern of bars, but they didn't know what caused them. And that's where Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin came along. She started looking at these patterns, and she, having been trained in Cambridge, was exposed to the ideas that were new and novel at that time, that being quantum mechanics and ionization and theories of the structure of atoms. And her PhD thesis was using the theory of quantum mechanics to describe the spectra of stars. And she used this, an Indian astronomer had this theory, Saha had the theory that it was the ionization of atoms. And she put that together to understand the composition of the stars, and that these variations in the spectra were due to the temperatures. In her work, she was also able to conclude that hydrogen and helium were the most abundant elements in the sun and also the stars, and therefore hydrogen and helium were the most abundant elements of the universe. Her degree was actually awarded from Harvard, because at that time Harvard didn't award doctoral degrees to women. So her degree was the first PhD in astronomy from Radcliffe. Her reaction, the reaction to her thesis was not exactly well received. Henry Norris Russell, who was the most prominent researcher in the field at the time, read her dissertation, dissuaded her from concluding that hydrogen and helium were the most abundant element, because he and his theory was that the composition of the sun was exactly the same as the earth, and that if you just heated the earth up, it would look just like the sun. And she had a different conclusion that contradicted his. So he had her include in her dissertation some kind of disclaimers that these results were improbably high and therefore almost certainly not real. Russell was intrigued by this, and he went and spent the next 4 years trying to prove or disprove her theory. And finally, 4 years later, coming at it from a different direction, Russell was able to show that Payne was absolutely correct. In his 1929 paper, he praised her work. However, still many people credited Russell for the discovery and not Payne. A few years later, Otto Struve, who read her thesis and has described it as the most brilliant PhD thesis ever written in astronomy. Sylvia Payne-Gaposchkin went on to study more astronomy, make profound discoveries about the structure of our Milky Way galaxy. She studied the variable stars, stars that change with brightness, and that led to a better understanding of the evolution of stars and how stars change over their lifetime. And she authored 3 very prominent books in the field. Her entire career was spent at Harvard. And at the time that she began her work at Harvard, women were not allowed on the faculty. So her work at Harvard was doing more of the low-level menial tasks that were allowed for women to do. She worked under Shapley, who was the head of the Harvard Smithsonian Observatory, and he retired in 1954. And shortly thereafter, she finally got the promotion and recognition that she was deserving of. She became the first woman to be promoted from within the faculty to a full professor, and she was also the first female department chair at Harvard. With her work and her PhD thesis, many women were open, the field of astronomy was open to them because she was groundbreaking in moving women from the sidelines and being kind of the ones that did all the menial little tasks to actually the mainstream researchers in their field. Richard Williams, who wrote an article about her for the American Physical Society in 2015, wrote that giants like Copernicus, Newton, and Einstein, each in his turn, brought a new view of the universe, and Payne's discovery of the cosmic abundance of elements did no less. I think it's really profound to think that we know what Copernicus, Einstein, and Newton, we've heard those names before, but Sylvia Payne-Gaposchkin is classified as one just in that same category as a giant who changed our world view, and yet many people don't even know her. There's a new book that's out, just published by the Harvard University Press this last year, and it's the biography of Sylvia Payne-Gaposchkin. So welcome, to invite you all to read more about her life. And I also want to thank my fellow presenters for sharing with all of us their amazing women who changed the world. And I want to thank Dr. Amanda Caleb for hosting this event, and for the entire team of faculty who organized all the Women's History events this month. And thanks to everyone for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed the evening. So I'll pass it back to Dr. Caleb.
Thank you, Dr. Manning, for telling us about one of the unknown giants, I think is a good way of maybe describing your presentation. Before we conclude for this evening, I want to turn the Zoom back over to Dr. Little to tell us about an exhibition that's coming up in the art gallery. So Dr. Little, the Zoom is yours again.
Okay, so we are opening Forced to Flee this weekend. Hopefully it's a quilt show, and we're in the middle of hanging now. So everyone send your thoughts and prayers and blessings. So this is the show, Forced to Flee. This is a quilt made out of life jacket material, and there's a lot. This isn't like your grandmother's quilt that you throw on your bed. These have texture, and these have different modes of artistry. This is made by a Korean artist, and this is also in the gallery. So please do come in and see it. It is here until after graduation, so you have lots of time, and maybe nudge your professors for extra credit to come see it, if that's any incentive to you. My class, you know, you're going to be coming in, so everyone please come to see this. This is a great way to honor women and really look at the global refugee crisis around the world, which does disproportionately affect women and children. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Little. And thank you once again to all our panelists for these excellent presentations. I think they were interesting, they were insightful. I think we all learned a number of things we didn't know beforehand. Even if we knew some of the women, we didn't know everything about these women. So I want to thank you all for giving of your time and your expertise tonight. And thank you all for those who attended. This is the last official event of a Women's History Month at Misericordia University, though the exhibition that Dr. Little just described is ongoing. So it's an extension. You can think of it as a long Women's History Month.
And we'll be tweeting through the end of the month.
And we'll be continuing to tweet on throughout the month of March. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Take care.